The early morning sun cast long shadows across Harold Peterson's meticulously maintained front lawn as he slowly made his way down his porch steps, each movement deliberate and purposeful despite his advanced age. At 93, Harold moved a bit slower than he used to, but his mind remained as sharp as the day he returned home from World War II nearly 8 decades ago. Every morning, without fail, Harold followed the same routine he'd established since his beloved wife, Martha, passed away 5 years earlier. He would wake at exactly 6:30 a.m., put on his pressed khaki pants, a clean white button-down shirt, and comfortable walking shoes that his granddaughter Jenny had given him for his last birthday. The neighborhood was peaceful at this hour, with only the occasional sound of birds chirping and newspapers hitting driveways. Harold's house, a modest two-bedroom ranch-style home painted a gentle shade of blue, stood out among the others on Maple Street. Not because it was the biggest or the most modern, but because it was the best maintained. The paint never chipped, the grass was always perfectly trimmed, and the garden bloomed with such vibrancy that passers-by often stopped to admire it. As Harold walked down his familiar route, he would tip his worn navy blue baseball cap to Mrs. Rodriguez, who was usually watering her plants next door. She always smiled and waved back, sometimes offering him fresh-baked cookies or bread. Today was no different, except she had made his favorite snickerdoodles. "Good morning, Mr. Peterson," she called out, already heading to her front door to fetch a small package of cookies wrapped in wax paper. Harold's daily walk took him exactly 3 blocks down Maple Street, 1 block east on Oak Avenue, and then back home via the small community park. The other regular morning walkers had come to expect his presence, and many set their watches by his punctual appearances. Some of the younger residents found it remarkable that a man his age maintained such discipline, but those who knew Harold understood that routine and order had been central to his life since his military days. Back at home by 7:45 a.m., Harold would spend the next few hours tending to his garden. His flower beds were his pride and joy, featuring roses of every color imaginable, marigolds that seemed to dance in the breeze, and the most impressive dahlias in the county. He had won the local garden club's Best Garden Award for 5 consecutive years, though he always insisted it was more about the love he put into it than any special gardening skills. The walls of Harold's home told the story of a life well lived. Black and white photographs of his military service hung alongside colorful family portraits spanning decades. The most prominent was his wedding photo with Martha, taken in 1952, showing them both young and full of hope for the future they would build together. Next to it was a more recent picture of him with his granddaughter Jenny, taken at her college graduation last year. Jenny visited every Wednesday afternoon without fail, bringing groceries and staying for dinner. She would listen to his stories about the war, about meeting her grandmother, and about the adventures they had traveling across the country in their old Chevrolet during the 1960s. Though Harold lived alone, these weekly visits kept him connected to family and gave him something to look forward to. The neighbors all knew Harold's schedule by heart. They knew that at precisely 4:30 p.m., he would settle into his front porch rocking chair, weather permitting, with a glass of lemonade and the day's newspaper. Children riding their bikes would wave as they passed, and Harold would smile and wave back, sometimes offering a piece of hard candy from the tin he kept by his chair. His life was simple but dignified, marked by the kind of quiet respect that comes from living honestly and treating others with kindness. The other residents of Maple Street often remarked that Harold Peterson represented the best of their community, a living reminder of a generation that had sacrificed so much for their country and asked for so little in return. As this particular day drew to a close, Harold sat in his favorite armchair by the window, looking out at his peaceful street. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, and a gentle breeze rustled through his beloved garden. He had no way of knowing that this tranquil life he had built for himself was about to face an unexpected challenge, one that would test his resolve in ways he hadn't experienced since his days in uniform. It began on a Tuesday morning in early spring, when the first rumble of motorcycles shattered the usual peace of Maple Street. Harold was tending to his prized roses when the sound hit him like a physical force, making his weathered hands pause mid-task. At first, it was just 3 motorcycles, their engines deliberately revved as they passed his house. By the end of the week, that number had grown to 15. The motorcycle club called themselves the Night Ravens, though there was nothing poetic about their presence. Their leather jackets bore a symbol of a black raven with red eyes, and their bikes were modified to be as loud as possible. They had discovered that Maple Street provided a perfect shortcut between the highway and their new clubhouse in the industrial district. Mrs. Rodriguez noticed how Harold's daily routine began to shift. Instead of spending peaceful mornings in his garden, he would wait anxiously, tools in hand, listening for the approaching thunder of engines. The bikers seemed to take particular delight in timing their rides to coincide with the neighborhood's quietest moments. "They're getting worse, Mr. Peterson," Mrs. Rodriguez said one morning, her voice heavy with concern. She had watched from her window as one of the bikers deliberately swerved onto Harold's lawn the previous day, leaving ugly tire tracks across his perfectly maintained grass. The neighborhood children, who once played freely in their front yards, were now quickly ushered inside whenever the distant roar of motorcycles was heard. The peaceful community that Harold had known for decades was transforming before his eyes. Even his beloved garden seemed to droop under the constant assault of noise and exhaust fumes. Jenny noticed the change in her grandfather during her weekly visits. The proud veteran who had always sat straight-backed in his chair now seemed to sink into it, his eyes constantly darting to the window at any loud sound. The stories he used to tell about his war days were replaced by worried discussions about the bikers and their growing boldness. "Maybe we should look into that nice retirement community across town," Jenny suggested gently one Wednesday afternoon, after watching her grandfather flinch at the sound of approaching motorcycles. Harold's response was firm. "This is my home," he said, his voice carrying the same determination that had once carried him through the battlefields of Europe. "I didn't fight overseas to be driven from my own property by a bunch of hooligans." The situation reached a new low when the bikers began using Harold's driveway as a turning point for their machines. They would swing their heavy bikes around, leaving black marks on the concrete he had carefully maintained for decades. Some would stop directly in front of his house, revving their engines until the windows rattled in their frames. The local police, when called, seemed helpless to intervene. "Unless they're breaking any specific laws, Mr. Peterson, there's not much we can do," the young officer explained apologetically. "The street is public property." Other neighbors began to avoid walking past Harold's house during the times when the bikers usually appeared. The once social atmosphere of Maple Street was eroding, replaced by a tense silence broken only by the recurring roar of motorcycle engines. One particular biker, who wore a jacket with "Snake" emblazoned across the back, seemed to take special pleasure in tormenting the elderly veteran. He would often ride his motorcycle up onto the curb, deliberately spraying gravel onto Harold's flower beds. The other bikers would laugh and cheer him on, their voices carrying across the once peaceful neighborhood. Harold watched from behind his curtains as his community changed. The morning walks he had enjoyed for years became tense exercises in timing and vigilance. His beloved garden, once a source of pride and joy, now bore the scars of motorcycle tires and deliberately thrown trash. Yet, despite the growing tension, something stirred in Harold's eyes whenever he watched the bikers pass. It wasn't fear, as many might have expected from a man his age. Instead, it was a calculating look, the same expression he had worn decades ago when facing seemingly impossible situations during the war. As the sun set on another noisy day on Maple Street, Harold sat in his favorite chair, his weathered hands resting on a small box of military medals and photographs he had brought down from the attic. The distant rumble of motorcycles echoed through the evening air, but this time, instead of flinching, Harold smiled slightly. He had faced worse odds before, and he was beginning to form a plan. The morning Harold decided to confront the bikers dawned clear and cool. He had chosen his moment carefully, waiting until the group made their usual mid-morning pass through the neighborhood. Today, however, instead of staying inside or working in his garden, Harold stood at the edge of his property, wearing his neatly pressed khakis and a clean white shirt. As the familiar rumble of motorcycles grew closer, Mrs. Rodriguez watched anxiously from her porch, her hands clutched around her coffee cup. She had never seen such determination in her elderly neighbor's stance before. The first few bikers roared past, but when they spotted the old man standing firmly by the road, they circled back, curious about this change in routine. Snake, the leader with the snake-embroidered jacket, cut his engine directly in front of Harold's house. The other bikers formed a semicircle behind him, their machines idling loudly. The contrast was stark, a single elderly man facing a wall of leather-clad bikers and rumbling machines. "Got something to say, old-timer?" Snake's voice carried a mocking tone as he removed his sunglasses. At 93, Harold wasn't a tall man, but he drew himself up to his full height, his military bearing evident in his straight spine and squared shoulders. "Yes, I do." Harold's voice was clear and steady, carrying over the sound of idling engines. "I've watched you boys disturb our peace long enough. This is a residential neighborhood, not a racetrack. There are families here, children trying to play, people trying to live their lives." A few of the bikers laughed, the sound harsh and dismissive. Snake dismounted his motorcycle, walking towards Harold with an exaggerated swagger. He towered over the elderly veteran, his leather jacket creaking as he moved. "Well, would you listen to that?" Snake's voice dripped with sarcasm. "Grant but here thinks he owns the street." He turned to his companions, encouraging more laughter. "What are you gonna do about it, old man? Call the cops again?" Harold didn't back down. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out something that made the laughter die in their throats. A small, worn photograph. It showed a much younger Harold in his military uniform, standing beside a tank in war-torn Europe. "I've faced worse than a group of boys playing at being tough." Harold's voice remained calm, but there was steel in it now. "I served my country so people could live in peace, not so they could be terrorized in their own homes." Snake's face darkened. He snatched the photograph from Harold's hand, glancing at it before tossing it to the ground. "That was then, old man. This is now. Your war stories don't mean anything here." The photograph landed in a puddle, water seeping into its aged edges. Harold's face tightened, but he didn't move to pick it up. Instead, he looked directly into Snake's eyes. "You're right. That was then, but the man who earned those combat medals hasn't gone anywhere." A younger biker in the group shifted uncomfortably on his seat. Something in Harold's steady gaze made him look away, but Snake wasn't finished. He stepped closer to Harold, his breath hot with anger. "Listen here, Gramps," he growled. "This is our road now. We ride where we want, when we want. And if you don't like it..." He left the threat hanging in the air. Mrs. Rodriguez had seen enough. She hurried down her steps, phone in hand. "I'm calling the police," she announced loudly. Several other neighbors had emerged from their homes, witnessing the confrontation. Snake glanced around, noting the growing audience. With a theatrical gesture, he bent down and picked up the wet photograph, making a show of wiping it on his jacket before holding it out to Harold. "Keep your memories, old-timer. They're all you've got left." As the bikers roared away, their engines seemingly louder than ever, Harold carefully tucked the damp photograph back into his pocket. His hands were steady, but Mrs. Rodriguez could see the slight tremor in his shoulders as the adrenaline began to fade. "Mr. Peterson," she said softly, touching his arm. "Come have some coffee with me." Harold shook his head. "Thank you, Maria, but I need to think." He turned and walked slowly back to his house, his posture still military straight despite the morning's confrontation. Inside his home, Harold sat in his favorite chair, looking at the now wrinkled photograph. The young soldier in the image stared back at him, and for the first time in years, Harold felt the old fire of determination burning in his chest. This battle wasn't over. It was just beginning. The morning after Harold's confrontation with the bikers, he discovered his mailbox lying on the ground, crushed and twisted as if it had been hit by something heavy. Tire tracks in the grass told the story clearly enough. Standing over the damaged mailbox, Harold felt his jaw tighten, but he remained calm as he surveyed the destruction. The attacks didn't stop there. Over the next week, the night ravens seemed determined to make Harold's life increasingly difficult. They no longer just passed by his house. They made it their regular stopping point. Some would park their bikes on his lawn, leaving deep ruts in the carefully maintained grass. Others would toss empty beer cans and cigarette butts into his prized flower beds. Officer Thompson, the young policeman who regularly patrolled the neighborhood, could only offer limited help. "The problem is, Mr. Peterson, we never catch them in the act," he explained, writing yet another incident report. "And when we do drive by, they're just sitting on their bikes, not technically breaking any laws." Harold's garden, which had won numerous local awards, bore the brunt of the bikers' malice. One morning, he found his beloved rose bushes had been deliberately damaged, their stems broken and flowers scattered across the lawn. Mrs. Rodriguez found him kneeling among the destroyed plants, his weathered hands gently trying to save what he could. "Come stay with me for a while," she'd offered, her voice thick with concern, "just until things calm down." But Harold refused to leave his home. Martha and I planted these roses together, he said quietly, referring to his late wife. I won't abandon them. The situation reached a new level when Snake and his gang discovered that Harold had installed a security camera. They made a show of parking directly in front of it, revving their engines until the noise became unbearable. When they finally left, Harold found the camera had been turned to face the sky. Jenny's weekly visits became increasingly tense. She would arrive to find new damage each time: a broken window, spray paint on the garage door, or motorcycle tracks through the flower beds. Her suggestions about moving to a retirement community became more frequent and urgent. "Grandpa, this isn't about giving up," she pleaded one afternoon, helping him clean up scattered trash from his yard. "It's about being safe. You've earned the right to live in peace." Harold's response was the same as always. "Running away never solved anything, Jenny. Your grandmother and I built this life here, and I intend to protect it." The police suggested installing more security cameras and forming a neighborhood watch, but these measures seemed to only provoke the bikers further. They began showing up at random hours, making it impossible for Harold to maintain his once predictable routine. The peaceful mornings in his garden became a thing of the past. Some neighbors, worried about their property values and safety, began to avoid Harold. Others watched helplessly as the situation worsened, unsure how to help the elderly veteran. The once friendly atmosphere of Maple Street had been replaced by an air of constant tension. Snake seemed to take particular pleasure in finding new ways to torment Harold. He would sit on his parked motorcycle in front of Harold's house, staring at the windows while slowly revving his engine. Sometimes he would bring his entire gang, turning Harold's front street into an impromptu motorcycle rally. One evening, as Harold sat in his darkened living room, he heard the familiar sound of motorcycles approaching. Instead of their usual roar past his house, the engines cut off suddenly. Through the window, he could see Snake and three others dismounting their bikes. They carried something in their hands: spray paint cans. Harold watched as they approached his front lawn. His hand reached for the phone to call the police, but he paused. Something about watching these men, so confident in their ability to intimidate an elderly veteran, stirred something deep inside him. His eyes drifted to an old trunk in the corner of his room, one he hadn't opened in years. Inside that trunk lay not just his military memorabilia, but something else, something that had been forming in his mind since the confrontation began. As he watched the bikers through his window, a plan started to take shape. Harold Peterson, veteran of one of history's greatest conflicts, realized that sometimes the best strategy isn't to match force with force, but to find an unexpected way to stand your ground. The morning after the vandalism, Harold knelt in his garden, methodically cleaning up the spray-painted mess the bikers had left behind. His hands moved slowly but purposefully through the damaged flowers, his mind working on something beyond the immediate destruction. As he picked up scattered pieces of trash, a crumpled piece of paper caught his attention. It was a flyer that had fallen from one of the bikers' pockets during their latest act of vandalism. Harold smoothed it out carefully, his eyes widening as he read the contents. The paper announced a veterans support meeting at the local VFW hall, and at the bottom was a familiar name: Michael "Snake" Thompson, Veterans Outreach Coordinator. Harold sat back on his heels, the paper trembling slightly in his hands. The discovery sparked a memory of something he'd noticed but hadn't fully processed: the military-style boots some of the bikers wore, the way they moved in formation when riding, the occasional glimpse of dog tags hanging beneath their leather jackets. Mrs. Rodriguez found him still sitting there, staring at the flyer. "Mr. Peterson, are you all right?" she asked, carrying over a glass of water. The morning sun was getting strong, and she worried about him being out in the heat. "Maria," Harold said slowly, "I think I've been fighting the wrong battle." He showed her the flyer, his weathered finger pointing to Snake's name. "These aren't just troublemakers. They're veterans, just like me." That afternoon, Harold spent hours in his study, pulling out old military records and photographs. He began to notice things he'd missed before. The way the bikers positioned their motorcycles, it wasn't random, but a defensive formation he recognized from his own military days. Their hand signals while riding weren't just casual gestures, but modified military commands. Jenny arrived for her weekly visit to find her grandfather surrounded by old military documents and newspapers. "Grandpa, what's all this?" she asked, concerned by the intense look on his face. "Research," Harold replied, showing her a recent local newspaper article he found. The story covered a veterans motorcycle club that provided support for soldiers returning from modern conflicts. The photo showed several familiar faces, including Snake, though he looked different in the picture, softer somehow, helping a young veteran at a support meeting. "They're lost, Jenny," Harold said quietly. "Just like we were when we came back. The difference is, we had each other back then. These boys, they're trying to find their way home." Harold remembered his own return from World War II, how difficult it had been to adjust to civilian life. He thought about the motorcycle club he and his war buddies had formed. Not so different from these young men, except they'd had older veterans to guide them through those troubled times. As evening approached, Harold heard the now familiar rumble of motorcycles. But instead of tension, he felt something different, understanding. Through his window, he watched Snake and his group park their bikes. Their aggressive posturing now seemed like armor to him, protecting something vulnerable underneath. Using his computer, a skill Jenny had patiently taught him, Harold began researching modern veterans' issues. He learned about PTSD, about the challenges of returning from Iraq and Afghanistan, about the high suicide rates among young veterans. The motorcycle clubs, he discovered, often served as lifelines for these men and women, providing the brotherhood they'd lost after leaving the service. In his garden, cleaning up the latest round of vandalism, Harold found something else, a dropped military challenge coin. He recognized it immediately. It was from the same unit his grandson had served in before his death in Afghanistan 3 years ago. The coincidence struck him like a physical blow. Mrs. Rodriguez watched from her porch as Harold stood in his damaged garden, holding the challenge coin. She had never seen such a complex mix of emotions on her old friend's face: grief, understanding, and something else, purpose. "I think I know what I need to do," Harold told her later that evening as they shared their usual cup of coffee. "These boys aren't really angry at me. They're angry at what they've lost, at what they've seen. They need someone who understands that." As darkness fell over Maple Street, Harold sat in his favorite chair, the challenge coin in one hand and his own dog tags in the other. Tomorrow would be different, he decided. Tomorrow, he wouldn't face them as an enemy to be defeated, but as something else entirely. The old veteran smiled slightly, remembering something his commanding officer had told him long ago. Sometimes the bravest thing a soldier can do is to recognize when it's time to change tactics. The next morning brought with it an unusual sight on Maple Street. Before the sun had fully risen, Harold Peterson emerged from his house wearing his full military dress uniform. Despite its age, the uniform had been meticulously maintained, every medal and ribbon exactly where it should be. The brass buttons gleamed in the early morning light. His movements were deliberate as he set up a single folding chair on his front lawn, positioning it to face the street. From inside his house, he brought out an old wooden table, placing it carefully beside the chair. On it, he arranged several items: his service photographs, military medals, and a coffee thermos with extra cups. Mrs. Rodriguez watched from her window as Harold settled into his chair, ramrod straight, his weathered hands resting on his knees. She noticed he had chosen to sit right where the bikers usually parked their motorcycles. "Mr. Peterson," she called out nervously, "are you sure about this?" Harold simply nodded, a calm smile on his face. "Some battles," he said, "are won without firing a shot." The morning wore on, and the familiar rumble of motorcycles grew in the distance. As the sound approached, Harold stood up slowly, adjusting his uniform jacket. When the first bikes rounded the corner, he raised himself to his full height and snapped to attention. Snake led the group, as usual. Upon seeing Harold in his dress uniform, he slowed his bike, confusion evident even behind his sunglasses. The other bikers followed suit, their usual aggressive entrance becoming uncertain. The formation of motorcycles came to a stop in front of Harold's house. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, with precise military bearing, Harold raised his right hand in a formal salute. He held it, steady and unwavering, as the bikers watched in stunned silence. Snake was the first to dismount his motorcycle. His usual swagger was gone, replaced by something else: recognition. His eyes moved from Harold's combat ribbons to the Bronze Star prominently displayed on the table. Without seeming to think about it, Snake's own hand came up in a return salute. One by one, other bikers began to dismount. Several of them, as if by instinct, also raised their hands in salute. The morning air, usually filled with the roar of engines, was now perfectly still. Harold lowered his salute and gestured to the extra coffee cups on the table. "Gentlemen," he said clearly, "I believe we got off on the wrong foot. Perhaps we could discuss this veteran to veteran." Snake removed his sunglasses, revealing eyes that had seen their own share of combat. He stepped forward, his gaze fixed on one particular photograph on the table, a young Harold standing beside his tank crew in Europe. "3rd Armored Division?" Snake asked, his voice lacking its usual hostility. Harold nodded. "Normandy through Germany." He picked up the coffee thermos. "These days, I prefer fighting my battles over coffee." A younger biker near the back of the group suddenly stepped forward. "Sir," he said, his voice cracking slightly, "my grandfather was in the 3rd Armored. He never made it home." Harold's face softened. "What was his name, son?" "James Miller, sir." Harold's eyes widened in recognition. "Jimmy Miller? He was in Baker Company." When the young biker nodded, Harold reached for one of the photographs on the table. "Come here, son. I think you might want to see this." The tension that had filled Maple Street for weeks began to dissolve as more bikers gathered around the table. Mrs. Rodriguez, watching from her porch, saw something extraordinary happening. The loud, aggressive group was transforming before her eyes into something else, soldiers paying respect to one of their own. Some neighbors, drawn by the unusual quiet, emerged from their houses to witness the scene. Instead of the expected confrontation, they saw Harold Peterson, still standing straight in his uniform, surrounded by leather-clad bikers who listened intently as he pointed to various photos and medals. Snake stood slightly apart, watching his group interact with the elderly veteran. His face showed a complex mix of emotions, respect, regret, and something that looked like hope. When Harold offered him a cup of coffee, Snake accepted it with a nod that carried the weight of understanding. The morning sun rose higher over Maple Street, shining down on an unexpected gathering of veterans spanning 3 generations of American conflicts, brought together by an old soldier who had remembered that sometimes the strongest way to stand up is to reach out. As Harold and the young biker examined the old photograph of James Miller, Snake moved closer to the table, his eyes fixed on a particular medal displayed among Harold's collection. It was a Purple Heart, its purple and gold surface catching the morning light. "I have one just like it," Snake said quietly, pulling a chain from beneath his leather jacket. Hanging alongside his dog tags was an identical Purple Heart. "Afghanistan, 2015. Lost half my unit that day." Harold's expression softened with understanding. "Different war, same pain," he replied, gesturing to his own medal. "Mine came with a German bullet in 1944. The man who saved my life didn't make it home." The other bikers had gathered closer now, forming a respectful circle around the table. Many of them began sharing their own stories, tales of service in Iraq, Afghanistan, and other conflicts. The tough exterior they usually presented began to crack, revealing the soldiers underneath. Mrs. Rodriguez, still watching from her porch, noticed how the group's body language had changed. The aggressive posturing was gone, replaced by the natural camaraderie of soldiers who had found common ground. She quietly brought out a tray of cookies, placing it on the table before stepping back. "Sir," one of the younger bikers spoke up, "that story about Baker Company. My grandfather used to talk about a sergeant who saved their whole unit during a German counterattack. Was that?" Harold nodded slowly. "That was a dark day. We lost good men, but we held the line." He paused, looking at the young man closely. "Your grandfather was Robert Jenkins, wasn't he? The radio operator?" The young biker's eyes widened in surprise. "Yes, sir. He never told me the whole story. He couldn't talk about it much." Harold reached into his collection and pulled out another photograph, this one showing the group of young soldiers gathered around a radio set. "That's him right there," he said, pointing to a fresh-faced young man with headphones around his neck. "He was one of the bravest men I ever knew." Snake had been listening intently, his usual hardened expression softening with each passing moment. He pulled up a chair, sitting down across from Harold. "We've been doing it all wrong," he said, more to himself than anyone else. "We formed this club to help veterans cope, but somewhere along the way—" "You lost your way," Harold finished for him. "It happens to the best of us. After the war, my friends and I struggled too. We were angry, lost. It took an older veteran to show us how to find our way back. The morning sun had risen higher, and more neighbors had gathered to watch the extraordinary scene unfolding on Harold's lawn. Instead of the usual tension, there was a sense of witnessing something profound, a moment of healing that transcended generations. One of the bikers noticed Harold's damaged garden and nudged Snake. Without a word, Snake stood up and walked over to examine the trampled flowers and torn-up grass. His face showed genuine regret as he turned back to Harold. "Mr. Peterson," he said, his voice carrying a new note of respect, "we done wrong by you, by this whole neighborhood. But if you'll let us, we'd like to make it right." Harold looked at the younger veteran thoughtfully. "Every soldier deserves a chance to make things right," he replied. "That's what America is all about, isn't it?" The other bikers had gathered around their leader, their faces showing a mixture of shame and determination. The young biker whose grandfather had served with Harold stepped forward. "Sir, my day job is landscaping," he offered. "If you'd let us, we could help restore your garden, make it even better than before." Mrs. Rodriguez watched as the group of bikers began making plans with Harold, not just for fixing the garden, but for regular meetings, for sharing stories, for bridging the gap between generations of veterans. She saw how Harold's eyes lit up as he discussed plans for a memorial garden section dedicated to fallen soldiers from all conflicts. As the morning turned to afternoon, the transformation on Maple Street was complete. The feared motorcycle gang had become a group of veterans finding their way back to honor and purpose, guided by a 93-year-old soldier who had never forgotten the true meaning of service. Snake stayed behind as the others began to leave, approaching Harold one last time. "Thank you," he said simply, extending his hand, "for seeing the soldiers we could be, instead of the men we had become." Harold took his hand firmly. "Welcome home, soldier," he replied. "Welcome home." 1 month after the turning point on Maple Street, Harold's front yard had become an entirely different place. Every Wednesday afternoon, the sounds of motorcycles still filled the air, but now they arrived with purpose rather than malice. The night ravens had transformed from neighborhood menace to neighborhood guardians. The garden, once damaged and trampled, now bloomed more beautifully than ever. Jake, the young biker who worked in landscaping, had redesigned it with special sections honoring veterans from different wars. Small plaques nestled among the flowers told stories of sacrifice and service, including one for James Miller from Baker Company. Snake, who now insisted everyone call him by his real name, Michael, had organized a weekly veterans' coffee meeting at Harold's house. The front lawn became a gathering place where old and young veterans shared stories, offered support, and helped each other navigate the challenges of post-military life. Mrs. Rodriguez couldn't help but smile every time she looked out her window. Instead of fearsome bikers, she now saw men in leather vests carefully tending to flowers, sharing coffee with Harold, or helping neighborhood kids learn about military history. The transformation seemed almost miraculous. Jenny arrived for her weekly visit to find her grandfather surrounded by a group of veterans, all listening intently as he shared stories from World War II. The young men sat on chairs they had brought themselves, some taking notes, others nodding in understanding as Harold described how he had dealt with his own post-war struggles. "The key," Harold was saying, "isn't to forget. It's to remember why we served in the first place, to protect our homes, our families, our way of life. Sometimes we just need a reminder of what that looks like." The night ravens had also become protectors of the neighborhood. They established a volunteer patrol, keeping watch over the elderly residents and helping with home repairs. Their motorcycles, once a source of terror, now brought comfort to the residents of Maple Street, knowing their veterans were watching over them. Officer Thompson, who had once felt helpless to help Harold, now regularly stopped by the veterans' coffee meetings. He found that many local issues could be resolved through the network of veterans who gathered there, their military discipline and sense of duty becoming an asset to the community. Harold's garden had a new addition, a small memorial fountain surrounded by benches. The bikers had pooled their resources to build it, creating a peaceful spot where veterans could sit, reflect, and find solace. The sound of running water replaced the angry revving of engines that had once dominated the street. One particularly special afternoon, the group organized a ceremony to honor Harold. They presented him with a leather vest, custom-made with his World War II unit patches, and a special patch identifying him as the Night Raven's Elder Commander. Harold wore it proudly over his usual button-down shirt. You've given us something we didn't even know we were looking for, Michael said during the ceremony, his voice thick with emotion. A purpose beyond our pain, a way to serve that doesn't involve fighting. The neighborhood children, who had once hidden from the bikers, now gathered eagerly when they arrived. The veterans taught them about respect, service, and the importance of community. Harold watched with pride as his unlikely brotherhood passed on the values he had spent a lifetime defending. Jenny noticed the change in her grandfather, too. He stood straighter, smiled more often, and had regained the spark in his eyes that had dimmed during the Troubles. The weekly veterans' meetings gave him a renewed sense of purpose, a chance to continue serving by helping younger veterans find their way. As summer turned to fall, Harold sat in his favorite chair, watching the sunset over his transformed garden. The sound of motorcycles approached. Michael and a few others arriving for their evening check-in. They always made sure their elder commander had everything he needed before night fell. Mrs. Rodriguez brought out coffee and cookies, as had become her custom. "Mr. Peterson," she said, setting the tray down, "who would have thought those troublemakers would become our guardians?" Harold smiled, adjusting the leather vest he now wore over his usual attire. "Sometimes," he replied, "the best soldiers are the ones who need someone to believe in them first." The evening air filled with the sounds of friendly conversation and occasional laughter as the veterans gathered around their mentor. On the street where conflict had once reigned, peace had found an unexpected home, and an elderly veteran had found a new way to serve, not by fighting battles, but by helping other soldiers find their way back to themselves.